Hello, this is Jay Mitchell. We're back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have super duper not at all biased messaging from the VA posted by Cattle Dog Curmudgeon, and that looks like a screenshot of the VA's website. And there's one part that's kind of in highlighted. It says President Trump opposes a large lapse in appropriations. On September 19th, the House of Representatives passed, with the Trump administration's support, a clean continuing resolution to fund the government through November 21st. Unfortunately, Democrats are blocking this continuing resolution in the U.S. Senate due to unrelated policy demands. And yeah, that just goes to show you. I think the lesson here is we shouldn't be having government websites in the first place. It's like we shouldn't be having a government in the first place because it's going to be inherently biased to who is ever in control of it, whatever they want the websites to say, or what they want the government and what they want the government to do. Personally, I think they should have probably took a more neutral tone here rather than saying President Trump's in the right, the Democrats are in the wrong. But ultimately, since he's in control of the government, ultimately all the government websites are gonna share Trump's point of view rather than a more neutral and nuanced point of view. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And then next we have Death Penalty, posted by Fast Seaworthiness 739, and that's a cross post from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit, and it looks like a political compass meme, and the green lib left says abolish the death penalty, and he's the crying red-eyed Wojak, and then the crying red-eyed Wojak and the for off-right says expand the death penalty, and then the thinking Wojak for lib-right says which one is cheaper to litigate. And yeah, I guess I would kind of agree with that. Ultimately, I'm personally against the death penalty. I think people shouldn't be, even if you do take away, kill someone else, and it's on camera, and you're 100% guilty. That doesn't mean that the state should have the ability to kill you, because if the state has the ability to kill one person, it has the ability to justify killing anyone it feels like, and that's not personally something that I care for. If that being said, ultimately people will justify if they justify, and the death penalty is they're part of that. If the government just wants to justify killing people, they ultimately have the legal monopoly and force to justify doing whatever they feel like, and that does include killing people. Although I personally am very much against lethal injection because it takes away individual autonomy. If it were up to me, the death penalty would be more something like the Most Dangerous Game, where we'd throw the death penalty person on a prison island and they'd be hunted for sport, but they'd be able to defend themselves if they feel like it, because at the very least that won't take away their individual autonomy. Some people might say, "Oh, that's cruel and unusual," but ultimately, cruel and unusual are going to be subjective terms. I personally find lethal injection to be cruel and unusual because it takes away individual autonomy, but apparently the Supreme Court doesn't. So that's ultimately how it just goes to show you can't have subjective terms like cruel and unusual in your Bill of Rights, because ultimately also everything can be argued to be subjective term to some extent, but if a term can be seen as subjective, everyone's gonna have a differing opinion on what it means, and you definitely see that when it comes to no cruel and unusual punishment in the Bill of Rights. Next we have Trump publishes an executive order: U.S. military will defend Qatar in the event of an attack from another country, from WhiteHouse.gov, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosses from the military subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think he's just trying to deflect from Israel. A lot of people he's trying to push, Qatar, he's trying to push, Qatar, he's trying to push, I might be a Qatari asset. Well, in reality, I think everyone knows he's much more an Israeli asset than a Qatari one. I'm not saying Qatar has absolutely no influence over him. They give him the private jet after all. But, I definitely think stuff like this is trying to deflect from Israel. And yeah, I think it would be interesting if Israel attacked Qatar. What he'd do? I think it'd probably be like the last time when Israel attacked the Hamas leadership in Qatar. He kind of said, Israel, don't do that. That's he can tell, he can say Israel don't do that, but Israel's ultimately the one who's, I think, really pulling the strings here. And people might say, oh, Qatar has influence too, but, I definitely think it pales in comparisons to Israel's influence. If he was really in Qatar's pocket, he'd be bombing Israel left and right because of Israel's attack on Hamas's leadership there. But, Israel's the one I think he's really in their pocket the most. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have mega YouTuber/agitator Nick Shirley is forced out of a protest by community members of Portland, Oregon. ICE snipers on a nearby building then flashed the protesters with their laser aiming modules, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's crosspost from the LOL subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think he should have been there in the first place. I personally, if he wants to get involved with standing up to Antifa, that's fine. But I personally just let Antifa do their own thing and don't pay attention to them. It's mostly just a bunch of LARPing leftist losers. Say that 3 times fast. That's very literal. LARPing leftist losers, and it's very much a lot of politics these days is just LARPing. And I think you just got to avoid Antifa and just let them burn themselves out. That's why I think they've been so much less prominent this Trump term than Trump's last term, because they burned themselves out in 2020 of stuff like the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone over in Seattle, and now they're pretty much less prominent than they were back then. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And yes, and next we have History for Humans on Instagram. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to make fools of themselves on social media when they reference it. A repost from last year, hashtag History Teachers, hashtag History Matters, hashtag Civil War, hashtag MAGA, hashtag US History, from Instagram.com, posted by Mundanity13. That's a post from, History for Humans. And it looks like it's a guy who says, "How I know, feeling that my side 100% won the Civil War," and it says history teacher says. I guess that guy's seems to be more of a conservative guy, and I personally would agree. I do think if the Civil War does break out, I think the right is definitely probably going to win it, because they have access to the most food production and most of the land and territory. The left has, I would say, a greater population in the cities, but the cities themselves are mostly just urban wastelands that don't produce much material, and a lot of the left they're just too busy LARPing on Reddit and other social media to actually put up a fight. I definitely do think you see a lot of right-wing LARPing these days as well, but when push comes to shove, when it comes to putting up a fight, I definitely think the right would be able to put up a much bigger fight than the left. So that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have Trump, in effect, admits that his own policies are badly screwing over on one of his core constituencies, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross-post from the Leopard Eats My Face subreddit, and that's the truth from Donald Trump on Truth Social. The soybean farmers of our country are being hurt because our China is for negotiating reasons only, not buying. We've made so much money on tariffs that we are going to take a small portion of that money and help our farmers. I will never let our farmers down. Sleepy Joe Biden didn't enforce our agreement with China when they were going to purchase billions of dollars of our farm product, but soybeans in particular, it's all going to work out very well. I love our patriots, and every farmer is exactly that. I'll be meeting with President Xi of China in 4 weeks, and soybeans will be a major topic of discussion. Make soybeans and other row crops great again. And yeah, personally, I guess that's Trump being honest that his tariffs might be hurting soybean farmers. But I personally would agree. I do think tariffs might be well intentioned, encouraging people to buy local rather than buy from foreign countries. But ultimately, I do think they go against the free market. You could make the argument, well, China subsidizes its government, subsidizing its industries like solar panels, so why should they get to come over here tariff free? And ultimately, I would say the libertarian position is to be against government subsidies as well. And yeah, but ultimately, if something is made and the government wants to subsidize it, that's ultimately people will justify. It's just like the U.S. They don't justify tariffs. Ultimately, they'll justify tariffs. I don't care for Chinese government subsidies or U.S. tariffs. I think they both go against the free market. But ultimately, people will justify what they justify, and the government has legal monopoly on the legal use of force to justify whatever it feels like, even if I don't personally care for it. Then we have Trump making plans to send billions in cash ballots to farmers with taxpayer money, from Politico.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really think anyone should be bailed out. Personally, I think the problem in the first place here is the tariffs. But, ultimately, I don't think two wrongs make it right. I'd be against the tariffs, but I'd also be against any bailout to farmers. I'd say it's better than bailing out big business. But, the government shouldn't be bailing anyone out. People need to rely on themselves rather than the state. And that's very much the libertarian position. Then we have government workers say their out-of-office replies were forcibly changed to blame Democrats for shutdown. Original title, archive link for paywall. And that's an archive link from, it's an archive link from Wired. Government workers say their out-of-office replies were forcibly changed to blame Democrats for shutdown. And I was supposed to buy Dr. Who 07. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for how the government workers had their all-office replies changed to blame the Democrats for the shutdown. But ultimately, as I said previously, the government can justify doing whatever it wants. And if you're a government employee, well, your employer can justify doing whatever it wants. That's why I'm personally very much against being employed by the government, because ultimately your employer does have a lot of power and control over you, and when you're employed directly by the government, that power does go to the government. And keep in mind, the government already has a lot of power and control over you anyway, even if you're not a government employee. So I think that's very much the lesson here. The lesson here is don't let the government. Don't work for the government if you don't want the government to justify changing your emails and all that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Karina Villa protecting her constituents by literally running ice off the streets in West Chicago and yelling to residents to stay inside their homes, based or not, posted by Agent of Dallas, and that's crosswords from the Just Gals Being Tricked subreddit. And yeah, personally, I guess that's good. That's kind of good. Personally, I don't really care for this politician standing up against ICE, though, because both are ultimately federal government or government state or employees of the state. But just because ICE is bad doesn't make Karina Villa good. I'm sure if her side was the one pushing everyone around, ICE is very much an outgroup to her and the left. But I'm sure if it was the woke brigade pushing everyone around rather than ICE, she'd be silent and she wouldn't be chasing ICE she wouldn't be chasing them off the streets. And that's just where it goes to show you. It's for a lot of politics, it's just basically who's in the in group, who's in the out group, and it's nothing more than that. Even though I would argue that it's all pretty much just theater. The state just wants to distract from the fact that it controls pretty much everything, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Matt Welch. Andrew McCarthy has not been a fan of James Comey. In today's National Review, he says there's no case. This is so inconceived that the longer one analyzes, the worse it gets. Yes, it's obviously political retribution. You can tell by reading the True Socials of Donald Trump, posted by B. Hart Horry, and that's crosswords from the We the Fifth subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for how they're going after Comey. I don't really care for Comey either. But ultimately, it's one thing to talk about political retribution, and then ignore what happened to Donald Trump over Biden's term. During Biden's term, the Democrats clearly wanted political retribution against Trump, but only now the shoe is on the other foot, and they think it's the worst thing ever. And ultimately, I personally don't really care for political retribution, but it's something that if people want to justify it, that's on them. When the left had control of the state, it was completely justified. That the political retribution of Trump was completely justified. But now that he's back in power, suddenly it's the worst thing ever, and just goes to show you, no values, only teams. Next we have the Supreme Court fight over whether gay and trans people can be cured explained, from Vox.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's across posts from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is if you want to think gay and trans people can be cured, you should be able to. It shouldn't be up for the courts to litigate. I think that's a lot of the courts these days. The courts these days, they shouldn't be litigating issues like marriage and all that. That's very much the libertarian position. We need stuff like marriage out of state control, and it's the same with this. If you want to think gay and trans people can be cured of their gayness or transness, you should be able to. And if you don't want to think that, you should be able to. But the state shouldn't be ruling on it one way or the other. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump announces he is handing government power over to Project 2025. I can't believe the radical left Democrats gave me this unprecedented opportunity. Posted by CH4Locks, and that's crosswords from the Cult Headquarters subreddit, and that's a tweet from Ron Filipkowski, who tweeted, Trump during the campaign, I never even heard of Project 2025, don't know anything about it, don't know who was involved, and it says Trump today, and links to a True Social from him. I have a meeting today with Russ Vought, head of Project 2025 fame, during which of the many Democratic agencies, most of which are a political scam, he recommends to be cut, and whether or not those cuts will be temporary or permanent. I can't believe the radical left Democrats gave me this unprecedented opportunity. They're not stupid people, so maybe this is their way of wanting to, quietly and quickly, make America great again, President DJT. And yeah, personally, I didn't really care for the Project 2025 fear-mongering, it was just a generic Republican policy wish list, pretty much, that the Heritage Foundation put out every year, but there was no Project 21 or Project 2017 or 2013, or at least the media didn't push it as much. But, I think if Trump wants to do it, that's fine. It's pretty much just a generic Republican policy wish list. But, the fear-mongering over it was just kind of tiresome, If you want to think it's the worst thing ever, that's fine. But, it's really just a generic Republican policy wish list, despite what Reddit would have you believe. Reddit would have you believe it's literally Nazi Germany in the 1930s, when in reality, that's just what Reddit says of anything Republicans these days, and that's why people don't really care when people say Nazi, fascist, or Hitler anymore, because, Reddit, the woke Reddit leftists have overused those words so much, it's like the boy who cried wolf, constantly yelling wolf, or the Chicken Little yelling the sky is falling. Eventually you just start toning it out. Next, we have massive Fourth Amendment violation by ICE in Chicago, posted from ABC7Chicago.com, posted by LegioX. And that's a headline from, this headline says, ICE agents raid South Shore apartments. Trump says Chicago could become a military training ground. And yeah, personally, I don't think ICE should be raiding apartments, but, ultimately, the government can justify doing whatever it wants to justify, since they have legal monopoly use of force, and since they control the court system as well, oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. So yeah, the libertarian position is, you gotta stay armed. If the cops ever come to your door and say we want to come in, and you say no, and then if they say we have a warrant, you should still say no, because a warrant's ultimately just state permission to justify itself doing whatever it wants to. And if they do try and force their way in, that's why it's good to be armed in case that ever happens, because you guys should have every right to defend yourself if they do try and force their way in. It's called a private residence. The state has no bearing coming into it if they feel like it, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have President publishes enemies list, the White House website, and it's just Democrats speaking the truth from TechDirt.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's cross-post from the technology subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the president publishing an enemies list. I think Richard Nixon had one too. But ultimately, if he wants to publish an enemies list, that's fine. But I'm sure if it was Joe Biden publishing his enemies list, Reddit would be completely fine with it. But since it's the out group doing it rather than the in group, it's the worst thing ever. And just like I said, it's just like all the other posts in the subreddit. Next, we have, on all caps, Trump just signed executive order to fund all sanctuary cities immediately, posted by Responsible Cal 904, and that's across from the Biden is not my president subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think, if he wants to not give federal government money to sanctuary cities, I think that's completely fine. No one's entitled to money from anyone else. And that includes, people, a lot of Redditors threw a hissy fit when Trump proved, I'm not going to give Mamdani money in New York City if he wins. And ultimately that just will show you, if the government, can justify doing whatever it feels like with its own money, and the federal government has its own money, the state government has its own money, the local government has its own money, and ultimately, each of them can justify doing whatever they want with their own money, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. That's why I think the libertarian position is if you want to give your government money, that's fine, but you shouldn't be forced to do so if you don't want to, and if you don't consent to taxation, you shouldn't be forced to pay them, and this is a good example as to why, because that taxpayer money might not be going to where you think it should be going. Next, we have the rise of America's young socialists. Communism, they acknowledged, hasn't worked anywhere but in the world. It had been attempted, at least not yet. Posted from WallStreetJournal.com, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they said, well, the mainstream Democratic Party's popularity sunk to a 30-year low, and its leadership appears uncertain of how to oppose Trump. The far left seems vigorous, particularly among the young. 60% of Americans aged 18 to 29 have voted favorable of socialism. Some are venturing even further left. On a recent evening, 15 comrades of the Revolutionary Communists of America gathered for their weekly meeting. At times, the meeting felt like a support group, in this case for people suffering from the modern economy. Communism acknowledged hadn't worked anywhere in the world that had been attempted, at least not yet. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for communists. As the old saying goes, the only good communist is a dead communist. But, ultimately, if they want to do that, if they have their own communist party, I think they should be able to, but as long as they're not forcing it on anyone else. And yeah, personally, I think you have to be either very young or very stupid to be a communist. But ultimately, if you want to do it, that's on you. It's very much like cutting yourself. I personally wouldn't cut myself, but if you want to justify cutting yourself all day, well, that's a you decision, not a me decision. Next, we have Trump charts path to total control amid government shutdown from Axios.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, it seems like we've had this, Trump's going to take total control any day now for the past 10 years. And, if you want to keep saying that every day for the past 10 years, that's fine. but eventually people are going to start toning it out when it seems like it's every headline for the past 10 years. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. Oh, actually, I have something else I want to add. It was a tweet I did today. I said, a lot of people want unity in these trying times, but much like collectivism, it's not something that can be forced. It needs to be voluntary. Forced unity is not unity; it is merely submission. And I tweeted that, and I think that's very much where we should be right now. If people want to form voluntary collectives, that's fine. But with a forced collective like the state, where you're forced to obey all its laws or face fines or imprisonment, or then the very libertarian position is, we shouldn't have that. We need voluntary collectives, not forced collective, and private property rather than public property, and that's my thoughts there. So I think we're going to wrap up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.